Welcome, Copper Prepper here again at the Hudspeth Bugout. I like to explore possible outcomes and futures, as unlikely and fictional as they may or may not currently be. Today I'd like you to consider such a possibility with me around the ancient practice of barter, and if it will be allowed in a society where every transaction is digitally tracked. Could barter become illegal? Of course not, you might say. They can't make barter illegal. You can't control people like that. I tend to agree. But in a new world where freedom passes track your every physical movement and allow gleeful citizens access to places they forget they once freely accessed without one, how quickly would such people give up their freedom to engage in the ancient practice of swapping one item of value for another, if they were afraid that getting caught in the act of bartering would mean their government-issued digital checks might stop coming? It's been on my mind of late as I think of things that could hold value regardless of the state of an economy or where you might find yourself in the world. For example, copper, as I spoke of in my last video. Well, some talk about the confiscation of gold or the banning of Bitcoin, but what about barter itself? Barter, the human practice of exchanging one thing of value for another, is as old as the hills and older than currency by far. Some sources date it back 6,000 years in Mesopotamia as a policy, but it's easy to imagine it has existed much longer informally since that day in the misty dawn of humanity when one person traded fruit for a scrap of fur hide. It's still very much a viable method of trade outside of the common use of currencies, even today when people wave their Apple phones to pay at Starbucks like Harry Potter invoking debt magic with his wand. But could it someday become illegal to barter if governments determine that they want to track or control everything to improve our safety or save the world? Controls on barter do exist currently. Did you know that the IRS actually expects you to declare the value of a service or property obtained by barter? For example, if you agree to help a friend build a fence in exchange for a 12-pack of beer, the IRS website states, "The IRS reminds all taxpayers that the fair market value of property or services received through a barter is taxable income. Both parties must report as income the value of goods and services received in the exchange." It's likely this was intended to target private business owners or bad actors and criminals who might use barter as a way to evade taxation. In some cases, it could apply to those who might want to trade goods or services for controlled items like firearms, but there is another government entity entirely for that. It's hard to imagine the IRS hiding in the bushes looking to catch a couple of teenagers off duty behind a McDonald's, swapping a stack of used Pokemon cards for a slingshot and a box of rocks. But if you read the IRS language, it doesn't appear to make an exemption for smaller exchanges. If taken as written, it would indeed be an onerous burden to track, much less pay taxes on if you live, for example, in a like-minded community in the Ozarks, and regularly help others to build barns, or trade chicken eggs daily for baked bread with a neighbor, to name a couple of examples. Especially if you live off-grid and actively avoid working a paying job in dollars, and instead exchange your goods and services for your livelihood precisely to get away from banks and government. Consider that the IRS as it stands today expects you to involve them in such things you may have thought were between two people and a handshake. What if you want to pay your friend the butcher for a rack of venison with silver coins from your stack, or some extra ammunition he has on hand for a rifle he no longer owns? Maybe a few shiny copper bullion rounds for a Zippo lighter and a cigar? How about your other buddy looking to trade his micro-crafted keg of brew? Now you are entering into territory that the government may be more interested in tracking, and not just around cost. So let's take that expectation of government involvement one step further. What if in some not too impossible to imagine future, All purchases or exchanges that once occurred with paper currency and coins or debit and credit cards must pass instead through some kind of digital dollar that resembles the Bitcoin blockchain, where every transaction is recorded. We already have big tech actively snooping on our purchases, and executives in big tech in many cases end up finding advisory or other positions in the US government. So it's not hard to imagine policy trending toward more surveillance, not less. Google already directly links anonymous bank and credit card records it purchases to your online profile. For example, that time you bought paint at Lowe's on June 5th, and a day later visited Lowe's again for a set of brushes, show up as specific dollar amounts on an anonymous bank statement record that Google bought for market research. But you also used Gmail to get a mailed receipt on both occasions. You thought those things were unrelated. Not anymore. Those dollar amounts and dates being unique, Google, which of course owns Gmail, now knows that you purchased those items at Lowe's. Google can then look at the rest of your purchases and determine if they're targeted ads toward you on your smartphone or the YouTube videos you watch, also owned by Google, were effective in the real world and not just online. Did you also go across the street and buy a burger at Sonic right after they flashed an ad at you? Your no longer anonymous credit card statement will tell them. The only way around the level of surveillance I've described here, a way, at least, to remain anonymous, is to use cash, wear a mask. Some stores use video to identify shoppers and track purchasing preferences, after all. And never ever asked for an emailed receipt. With former Google employees in positions to control government policy, you can see how they might not only want to eliminate cash, but also barter in order to have a complete picture of what you purchase outside of a trackable system. As creepy as tracking your Lowe's purchases using anonymous credit cards is, Google is not going to punish you for an incorrect choice of Whataburger instead of Sonic. Now take it one more step in a dystopic direction. What if a government that seeks to control behavior and purchasing practices of its citizens, what if they use aspects of cryptocurrency blockchain technology and pair it with existing big tech snooping technology? What if such a hyper-controlling surveillance government wants you to make all the correct choices in everything from what you eat to what you drive? What if they control the narrative on social media, the news, and can deplatform anyone who shares another viewpoint? Why would a government want to exercise such control? It's not like you live in a totalitarian dictatorship, right? Well, imagine for a moment that, at least on the surface, their overriding concern and plea to the emotions of their citizens is climate change. If they were so obsessed with tracking your every move to prevent climate change, then any bartered exchange of goods or services outside of the digital currency could be considered a danger to the climate, and by extension, if you follow their logic, national security and prosperity. After all, how can you ensure your citizens are making the purchasing decisions you wish to enforce if you can't see what they're bartering? What if Jim Slade is trading his old gas-guzzling pickup that's been idle in his front yard for Jane Oakley's most flatulent and milk-poor cow to graze his overgrown acreage, giving both a new lease on life? Fictional climate control czar Greta Schwab wouldn't approve of that exchange. She'd rather see the truck sent to be recycled for scrap and the cow put to sleep, since meat is off limits too. No, this dystopian government in our pretend scenario here wants all purchases made through a digital currency and to tie those to a social credit rating system that rewards good citizens and punishes bad choices. Are you purchasing and perhaps storing an unfair amount of food? Penalty. Did you buy a gas-guzzling vehicle for pleasure? Penalty. Did you purchase a t-shirt from an artist who was deplatformed due to questionable speech? Penalty. Rather than outright ban your freedom to do these things, they can impact you in other ways. The campy old Stallone action sci-fi movie Demolition Man had the main character repeatedly penalized by computers with fines for bad language he was overheard speaking. A penalty for bad language by computers always listening is no longer a stretch of science fiction today. China's own social credit system, which restricts people from purchasing train tickets if they have a naughty credit rating for something like criticizing the government, proves that. On the flip side, you could be rewarded for behaving well. Did you buy an insect protein burger and kale chips using credit at Starbucks after taking a Tesla Uber there? Good job, your social credit was bumped up by a point. The stern-faced, self-appointed morality police would decide that the AI algorithms that will be set to detect if you are a certain type of non-compliant person based on your purchases and begin to restrict your freedom to travel and assemble with others accordingly. Wrongthink can spread, so best to keep such people isolated and monitored. Compliant citizens who share their good choices, like a crisp photo of that tasty burger on Instagram, will be rewarded with expanded travel freedoms to share their sunny and Pollyanna-like approach to life with others. I'm doing my part. #blessed. Some new forms of money threaten such a future. Bitcoin is often criticized as being a means of anonymous dark funding for terrorists and a favorite of black markets. This criticism is suspect, since the blockchain keeps a record of transactions, even while offering partial anonymity. If you want your illicit activities to remain completely anonymous, however, cash physically handed under the table is still king, which is one reason they want to get rid of cash. This stereotype of Bitcoin as a currency for bad people is reinforced by those in power, such as the Federal Reserve, in part, I believe, because they perceive cryptocurrencies as a threat to the financial systems they control. But if you think about it, the act of trading dollars under a table is not too far from simple barter. Universally accepted cash, like dollars, make large purchases easier, but terrorists could, in theory, barter and exchange their services for a delivery of rockets or crates full of food and water instead of cash. Bitcoin's blockchain, however, is one bit of the crypto technology that aligns with concepts of tracking and control. Old forms of currency like gold have also been targets. Gold has been confiscated by the USA government before, though it is probably better to categorize what happened in 1933 as a nationalization that helped the government print more money, since they were on the gold standard at the time. It wasn't really confiscated as a means of removing the freedom to trade privately or avoid fiat currency, but rather to bolster the government's own gold reserves. In 1966 in England, however, owning more than a specific and relatively small amount of gold was banned for a reason that is more worthy of criticism in my opinion, namely to stop the fall of their fiat currency, the pound. So those people who bought gold and silver to avoid a collapse of fiat currency were ultimately targeted precisely for that reason. The government in that case sought to take away the freedom of individuals to escape from their fiat currency, to have an alternative. Trade dollars and tokens would likely remain exempt from such restrictions as a novelty, and because they are generally limited in what they can be used for. They are purchased with currency for the purpose of barter, but for which the items they can be exchanged, well, those are predetermined. A good example is the arcade or Chuck E. Cheese token used to play arcade video and mechanical games or activate rides in place of quarters. Some play with tokens might result in dispensed tickets that could be traded for stuffed animals, plastic toys, or candy. The Maui trade dollar is probably on the edge of such acceptability as another example. While mostly considered a collectible coin, it can be used at participating merchants in Maui for its face value of $2, but only in gift shops where food, clothing, and trinkets are the primary items for sale. Though certainly possible, you'd need a hefty bag of Maui trade dollars to purchase something like a solid gold necklace, and limitations might be set in place for such purchases. The oddball exception are the rare 999 pure, 0.999 pure, 1-ounce silver versions of Maui trade dollars, which could actually be redeemed for their $2 face value worth of goods. Unlikely to ever be a good deal unless the value of the dollar were to soar miraculously. The Fed coin, or digital dollars, sounded like science fiction only a few years ago, but now calls are coming from governments around the world to race toward digital currencies. While proponents cite these digital currencies as a way to go around banks and their deposit fees and delays, the enthusiasm behind the push seems a bit suspect to me, especially considering the powers that could benefit from tracking purchases if a digital currency is tied to that, even for the superficial excuse of keeping statements to know what you spent your money on. You'd need to trust the government to make those purchase details available only to you, and not the IRS, FBI, or some new agency aligned to something more Orwellian like social credit. A Fed coin could acclimate Americans to purchasing Bitcoin, said Jerry Brito, who heads Coin Center, a cryptocurrency advocacy group. But depending on the government's direction, such a currency could be used to track American spending, destroying the partial anonymity that was once the promise of crypto, he said. Bloomberg, March 22nd, 2021. So, imagine the people of the United States elect politicians who agree with the Federal Reserve to institute a Fed coin, banks aligned to this new system, and eventually all purchases are tracked. The government could know how many times a week you go to Joe's Crab Shack, what you purchase there, and determine that your unhealthy choices of food mean that you should wait in the back of the line for your medical care. Perhaps they see you bought some 22 LR ammunition and put you on a list of possible firearm owners. Even if your intentions are entirely innocent, that ammunition was for your uncle or backyard plinking, and the cheese fries at Joe's Crab Shack are something you always take back to work for your coworker. Even if these things are suitable for your life choices, the conclusions an AI algorithm could lead to about you as a person are concerning. Not to imply that there's anything wrong with owning a firearm, but I hope you get my point. Off the grid in an apocalyptic scenario, barter, such as the type I spoke about in another video on copper, you don't need to worry much about government surveillance. A community of Amish individuals, for all I know, similarly may feel free to build barns for one another and trade wheat for chicken eggs to their heart's content. In the heart of the Chihuahuan Desert on your land in Hudspeth County, what you trade with your neighbor is your own business. But in the confines of cities and suburbs covered with security cameras and cell and Wi-Fi towers where everyone carries a smart device, even innocently executed barter could be snooped on. How many times in a week might you run afoul of barter restrictions in such a society where barter becomes illegal? If you buy a coffee as a surprise for a friend and he insists you take one of the 2 donuts he bought, that's barter. The digital dollar system could see where you purchased 2 coffees and flag that. The cameras in your friend's own purchase history could result in concluding you both participated in illegal barter. The problem with a government or even a movement in a society that seeks to control free trade of goods is that people have a tendency to naturally adapt and eventually find a way that leads to freedom, even in cases where the item being traded or purchased outright is a controlled substance. Banning the sale of alcohol only fueled the speakeasies and bootleggers of the Prohibition era. Alcohol consumption actually increased under Prohibition. Similarly, I think, any attempt to outright ban barter would actually result in an increase in illicit underground trade and more creative means to get around government tracking of purchases and, by extension, tracking of behavior. National Prohibition of Alcohol, 1920 through 1933, the noble experiment, was undertaken to reduce crime and corruption, solve social problems, reduce the tax burden created by prisons and poorhouses, and improve health and hygiene in America. The results of that experiment clearly indicate that it was a miserable failure on all accounts. The evidence affirms sound economic theory, which predicts that prohibition of mutually beneficial exchanges is doomed to failure. Cato Institute, 1991. So, aside from the donut for a coffee type of dynamic spur-of-the-moment examples, what should you prepare to have on hand to barter then? Beans, band-aids, and bullion, as in metals? What would you stock up on aside from the obvious things? Food, water, and security tools. Perhaps your stock supply is not going to fit the usual choices, but rather something that aligns to a specific skill set you have in mind or want to develop. Perhaps you're really good at repairing devices and you might decide to stockpile a few boxes of components you think would be critical in an SHTF scenario, like parts to fix mobile phones and extra batteries. If you find yourself bugging out in the desert, like me, you might want raw materials that are hard to come by but have a lot of utility if you can work with them, like copper. Maybe you have an amateur level of experience being a doctor, or some limited experience in medicine. Perhaps the extent of taking care of sick animals on your ranch. And you want to stock up on medical supplies so you could be the country doctor or pharmacist in a pinch when there's no one else around. Or perhaps an herbalist who draws on the natural plants in your area for home remedies for things such as toothaches. Whatever your skill or stockpile of goods might consist of, barter is what societies will turn to when they aren't trying to take what you have by force. They can't make barter illegal, you say. And perhaps you're correct. But looking at the post-2020 world, I've come to expect just about anything, especially if it runs up contrary to personal liberty and freedom. Too many people in positions of power seem to be drunk on control and righteous causes to let little people and their so-called freedoms get in the way. If you value yours, perhaps it's time you considered getting out of the city or suburbs, move out to Hudspeth County, or wherever you can that's off-grid enough that no one will care much to monitor what you do with the things that you own. Until next time, keep your eyes peeled and your barter preps ready. And remember, you heard it first here at the Hudspeth Bugout.